So, good morning, everyone. Very happy to see a diplomat here and to see also students from Webster University. And actually, also thanks to all speakers who will be speaking now this morning. And also, we will have at least one person who will speak online with video. And unfortunately, we had one speaker from San Remo, Claudio Del Fabro, director of the Department of International Refugee Law and Migration, and unfortunately is ill. So we put some publicity on the refugee law courses, and actually excellent refugee law courses, and you have also leaflets there in the documentation, so we can still know what he would be speaking about. But yes, if you can close the door. Actually, you know, speaking human trafficking and human rights, of course, no reason for triumphalism, no reason for celebration, because 75 years after the Universal Declaration, as we know, many human rights are violated, and that's not so much celebration that we need today, but more mobilization. And mobilization, I would say, especially for victims of human trafficking. Because 23 years ago, we had the adoption of the Palermo Protocol on human trafficking and also on the Palermo Protocol on migrant smuggling. But still, today, there is an estimate of 50 million slaves. And it's more than ever in history. And that's why I think there is much work to do. And definitely, human trafficking is a complete contradiction to human rights, and especially right to life, liberty and security of persons, that's Article 3, prohibition of slavery, that's Article 4, freedom from torture, that's Article 5, right to work in just and favorable conditions, that's Article 23, right to an adequate standard of living, Article 25, right to education, Article 26, right to freedom of movement, Article 13, right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, Article 18, and right to be free from discrimination, Article 2. So, also, today, with new technology, raising awareness through events, collaborations between various people in society, creative contact and community engagement, we need to use also technology, and that's what we will be doing today, because we are recording this session, and it will be available online with subtitles, and we think that's why even if this morning we are a small crowd, we definitely need to be sure that it will be disseminated. And that's why I'm very happy now to give the floor to Dr. Umesh Palwankar. He is a friend, a former colleague of mine at CICRC, and after a long career in the legal department of the CICRC, he is now executive director of the Geneva Center for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue, and a co-organizer of this event with the Sovereign Order of Malta. So, Dr. Palwankar, I think you have interesting things to tell us. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Michel. And I would immediately wish to add how glad I am that this first collaboration between our respective institutions has begun with this one, and on a very critical issue whose consequences sat at the very core of human rights, constituted by, as you pointed out more details in the article, I would just say equality, freedom, justice, and above all, human dignity. Allow me now, with your permission, Michel, to say a few words about our Geneva Center. Yeah. So, our center is an independent human rights think tank and advocacy institution founded in 2013, based in Geneva, naturally, and holds special consultative status with ECOSOC. Our mandate and related activities are based on four main pillars, which is research and publications, training and national capacity building, always in human rights, of course. The third pillar is international advocacy, which consists of mainly, but not only, closely following and reporting on major human rights conferences and developments, in particular the Human Rights Council sessions and special sessions. And finally, it is to offer a platform for a global dialogue between the North, the South, intercultural, interfaith, on vital human rights issues. How? Through the organization of conferences and panel events. And this is one in which we do this together. And publishing their proceedings with the lessons learned and ways forward think piece added to it. And our focus areas include mainly equality, non-discrimination, including gender-based, just access to justice, education, women and children's rights, and empowerment of women and youth, and of course, more recently and increasingly, the right to an environment, healthy, clean, and sustainable, and business and human rights. These are the new frontiers of the human rights activities. Just to give you a few examples of this year, some panels that we held, for example, in January, last January, on women's and children's and girls' right to education, challenges and perspective. That was following the decision of certain authorities in certain countries to ban women and girls from education. The second panel in February was interfaith dialogue and reconciliation, creating and sustaining spaces of influence. The third was in June, surveillance technologies and human rights, the freedom security dilemma. The fourth panel is this one, we already know. And I would like to add that we held a major conference. It was more than a panel. It consisted of 3 panels and a high-level segment at the Palais this time, because we were co-sponsored by 3 permanent missions. So that made it much easier to have a room. On the 6th of September, two months prior to COP28, on environment, climate change, and women and children's rights, challenges, perspectives, and the role of indigenous peoples. Not the rights and role of indigenous peoples, their ancestral knowledge and practices too. So it was a very well attended panel. We had high-level officials from OHCHR, UNICEF, etc. We had special rapporteurs, among whom Dr. Ian Fry, David Boyd on environment and human rights, UNFCCC constituencies, youth and women, etc. So I invite you to visit, formally invite you to visit our website, and the report is available on it. And I advocate quite a lot with the permanent missions to see to it that it gets somehow one way or the other onto the table of the, let's see now, that's up to them to do the necessary. So this is just an example of panels and training sessions and so on. So I will quickly end there by just saying that human trafficking is really, one of the cruelest and most degrading violations of human dignity and equality, affecting millions. I just said 50 million. I wasn't aware of that figure. And its despicable consequences include slavery, forced labor, prostitution, gender-based violence, exploitation of children, organs, trafficking in organs, and it violates so many provisions of international law in different fields of international law. And we urgently really need to engage in a determined effort to ensure social justice. Thank you, Michel.
Thank you very much, Umesh, Dr. Palwankar. I think it's a good introduction. And now I would like to ask Monseigneur Vitillo, because Monseigneur Vitillo was head of the delegation of Caritas Internationalis in Geneva, and for many years he has now been a Secretary General of ICMC for 7 years. He is traveling a lot, so I would say he has also a lot of field experience. So, Bob, thank you very much for being with us today. And you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Michelle, for this invitation, and it's really a great honor and a privilege to offer some perspectives in this meeting that aims to reflect and plan actions in response to two human phenomena that are in stark contraposition and conflict, that is, human trafficking and human rights. The former has aptly been described by Pope Francis as an open wound on the body of contemporary society. The latter, which was solemnly and universally declared with no dissenting votes by the United Nations General Assembly, and here I quote the words of a former president of the UN Human Rights Council, an ambassador from Nigeria, who said, I quote, "Strove to articulate and codify the transcendent principles of the inherent dignity of each and every human person from the moment of conception to natural death." While governments had made significant efforts to preserve these human rights, as Michelle said, and also our last speaker said, I feel compelled to note with great regret that various situations in today's world point out the blatant disrespect for the human rights mechanisms that have been established, and even greater disrespect for the members of our human family who are the bearers of such rights. Human trafficking certainly represents one of the greatest human rights failures of past and present eras. Such failure may be rooted in our limited focus on the legal and technical aspects, with all due respect to the attorneys here, and promotion of human rights. While such elements are fundamental to such efforts, they are not at all sufficient. In this regard, at least in my opinion, the Catholic Church's approach to human rights may be quite helpful, since we never articulate a right without presenting its concomitant responsibility. Thus, as rights bearers, all members of the human family have responsibilities to recognize, promote, and defend both rights of their own as well as the rights of others. With regard to human trafficking, I believe that states, civil society, and individuals all need to understand and effectively respond to the root causes of human trafficking. Given the complex phenomena of human trafficking and of forced unsafe migration, I am fully aware of the impossibility to capture all the root causes in a short period of time. But I'll take this opportunity to cite some examples of efforts undertaken by my own organization, the International Catholic Migration Commission, or ICMC, to prevent human trafficking and smuggling, address the needs of its survivors, and advocate with the entire human family to eliminate this evil from our world of today and in the future. Since some of you may not have heard of ICMC previously, I'll give a brief introduction to this organization. It was founded by Pope Pius XII in 1951, and he gave us the mandate to form a network of Catholic institutions, including groups of Catholic bishops worldwide, as they respond to migration and refugee challenges. We quickly began by resettling refugees from Europe to North and South America and elsewhere, by protecting those who were vulnerable to abuse, even though we didn't use the words human trafficking in those days. We continue our resettlement and humanitarian program to this very day. We have some 300 staff working in some 40 countries. But this is only the tip of the iceberg when compared to the thousands of staff and volunteers engaged by local, regional, and global church efforts, by dioceses, religious congregations, Catholic-inspired organizations, and those good neighbors inspired by the gospel to fulfill Pope Francis's invitation to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate refugees and migrants wherever they may be. Now for some of the causes. Root cause number one, at least in my perspective, is extreme poverty and unequal access to enjoy basic human rights, to a life worthy of God-given human rights and human dignity, education at all levels, as well as decent work, housing, and the physical, social, and spiritual conditions that help children and adults to provide adequately for themselves and their families. Those deprived of such basic essentials of life easily become more vulnerable to human trafficking or to desperately seek unsafe migration routes. The 2023 Global Multidimensional Poverty Index from the UN Development Program shows that 1.1 billion out of 6.1 billion people, just over 18%, live in acute multidimensional poverty across 110 countries. Sub-Saharan Africa, with 534 million, and Southeast Asia, with 389 million, are home to approximately 5 out of every 6 poor persons. Nearly 2/3 of all poor people, 730 million people, live in middle-income countries, making action in these countries vital for reducing global poverty. In speaking about different causes of human trafficking, Pope Francis calls our attention to, I quote, the first place of poverty, underdevelopment, and exclusion, especially when combined with a lack of access to education or scarce, even non-existent employment opportunities. Root cause number 2, the lack of birth registration and other important documents. The 2020 report of the Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic issued this alarm, I quote, girls and boys also face considerable obstacles related to documentation and are vulnerable to exploitation through child labor or child marriage, often as a result of disappearance of male parental figures. Crucially, for their long-term prospects, a huge number of children have missed out on years of education and are currently out of school. This status quo will affect the ability of boys and girls to exercise their basic rights in innumerable ways as they grow older. The lack of such documentation prevents access to vital services and often forces migrant and refugee children and adults to seek the services of smugglers and traffickers to reach their destinations, to be reunited with family members, or to accept indecent or exploitative work situations. 1 in 4 children under age 5, 166 million on average, are not registered in the world today, since parents often are deterred from applying for such necessary documentation because of high costs and complicated bureaucratic procedures imposed by public offices. Similar challenges are faced by those migrants and refugees who do not have access to their academic diplomas or certificates for professional or otherwise specialized skills training. The Vatican's 20 points document toward the Global Compacts on Migrants and Refugees of 2018 encourages states, I quote, to adopt policies that require the registration of all births, providing each newborn with a birth certificate, and to enact legislation that enables the recognition, transfer, and further development of the foremost skills of all migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees in the host country. The International Catholic Migration Commission, in fact, is redoubling its efforts to encourage birth registration by working with local church-inspired organizations in Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Haiti, and India to train local parish volunteers to accompany parents as they apply for birth certification for their children. Root cause number 3, fixation of business almost exclusively on amassing more money and profit easily leads to the commodification and exploitation of people, which in turn could result in vulnerability of poor and marginalized people to human trafficking. The 2021 global estimates of the International Labor Organization indicate that 28 million were in forced labor. It should be noted that compared to 2016 global estimates, 10 million more people were in modern slavery. Most forced labor occurs in the private economy. 86% of forced labor situations are imposed by private actors, 63% in the private economy in sectors other than commercial sexual exploitation, and 23% in forced commercial sexual exploitation. State-imposed forced labor accounts for the remaining 14% of people in forced labor. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development reports that this type of labor is estimated to generate at least $150 billion per year of illegal profits in the private economy worldwide. That's cited by the ILO. Human trafficking occurs with the collusion of corrupt officials with criminal gangs. Addressing human trafficking and corruption jointly is more effective than addressing these two issues individually. Pope Francis warns, and I quote, "There is a sociological fact. Organized crime and the illegal trafficking of human beings choose their victims among people who today have little means of subsistence and even less hope for the future. To be clearer," he says, "among the poorest, among the most neglected, among the most discarded." For the past 5 years, ICMC has coordinated a multifaceted research, capacity building, and advocacy project in partnership with more than 30 Catholic-inspired organizations and the International Labor Organization on, I quote, "the future of work, labor after Laudato Si," which through primary research and collection of good practice models examine ways to prevent exploitative, indecent, and corrupt labor practices that often are linked to abuses of human trafficking, corruption, and exploitation of the most vulnerable people in society, and identifies good practice models being employed in various parts of the world. ICMC also is supporting programs of the local churches in Côte d'Ivoire to build skills, capacity, and to promote entrepreneurship among deportees who have been returned from Europe, but still are vulnerable to traffickers and smugglers. And in Central African Republic, to teach basic literacy and vocational skills to returning child soldiers. Root cause 4, the demand side. The Vatican's pastoral orientations on human trafficking points to, I quote, "the different areas in which the victims of human trafficking work or operate: agriculture, domestic work, prostitution, etc., and points out that, I quote, "consumers constitute a huge mass who seem largely unaware of the exploitation, yet enjoy the benefits of the services provided by trafficked persons." In her 2023 report to the UN Human Rights Council, UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, Shoban Mulali, declared, I quote, "taking seriously the obligations concerning prevention of trafficking in persons requires systemic and urgent law and policy reforms rooted in international human rights law, addressing climate change, environmental degradation, and the loss of biodiversity." End of quote. Pope Francis challenges us to examine our own consciences and behavior. I quote, "Certainly there is a lot of ignorance on the topic of trafficking, but sometimes there also seems to be a little will to understand the scope of the issue. Why? Because it touches close to our own conscience, because it is thorny, because it is shameful. Then there are those who, even knowing this, do not want to speak, because they are at the end of the supply chain as a user of the services that are offered on the street or on the internet." End of quote. ICMC works to prevent human trafficking among the vulnerable group of refugees and migrants in irregular situations by providing job training that leads to access to decent jobs or to starting their own businesses, and by maintaining safe spaces for socialization and learning among women and child refugees who are survivors of sexual and or gender-based violence. In Malaysia, where ICMC operates a service for refugee survivors of SGBV, we have constituted a refugee protection force from within the refugee communities to serve as first responders, monitor safety and progress of survivors, and to work to change harmful cultural practices and attitudes from within their own ethnic communities. I conclude by citing once again the words of Pope Francis, who has been such a driving force for the Church and for all people of goodwill to confront the root causes of human trafficking with persistence and determination, and with the grace of God to put the gospel into action. I quote, "Let us not pretend and look the other way. There is greater complicity than we think. These issues involve everyone." Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Monsignor Vicky-Bob. It's a very rich text, and I'm sure we will share this with participants and also online participants. And you rightly put the emphasis on root causes, and you describe them in a very concrete way, and actually pointed the finger at each of us, and to say we have all an individual responsibility to what's happening today. No, thank you very much. And I would like to add also, again, next Saturday, here in Geneva at Basilique Notre Dame, you shall be celebrating a Mass at 6:30. But it's not only a Catholic Mass, but it's also the anniversary of an interreligious statement, appeal, which was launched in 2014 in Rome, not only by the Pope, but
In Vatican City.
in Vatican, sorry. And the Pope Francis, the Archbishop of Canterbury, but also Muslim, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, and all were saying we need to eradicate, to abolish modern slavery. So this is also something to be highlighted, to say that not only we have religious congregations working on the ground, in the field, but also we have spiritual leaders everywhere in the world asking for mobilization against human trafficking. So now I would like to invite Paula Prudakowska. Paula, thank you for being with us. You are an officer of the International Bar Association, and you now also a legal consultant at Trial International, an NGO based in Geneva, who provides legal assistance to victims, litigates cases, and pushes human rights agenda forward. So, Paola, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Michel. It's good to be here today, and thank you all for attending today. As Michel mentioned, I'm working for an organisation called Trial International. Trial are a Geneva-based NGO, and their principal work is to seek accountability for survivors of war crimes. I've been asked today to consider corporate accountability in the context of human trafficking. So there'll be three areas that I will briefly look at. First of all, I'll provide an overview of the new due diligence obligations that have been introduced in Switzerland earlier this year on companies. Monsignor Vitello mentioned the supply chain, and that is, of course, a crucial part of what we're talking about in relation to human trafficking. Then secondly, I will just briefly describe a couple of cases that Trial have done bringing criminal complaints against Swiss companies for violations in their supply chain. Those cases, what's interesting about them is that those cases were rejected, and partly that is because there was a lack of a due diligence framework in Swiss legislation. So that's just to, I suppose, show you perhaps the power of what has happened this year by Switzerland introducing this new legislation. And then finally, I'll just make some reflections on how this regulation is going to impact trafficking, specifically in the context of child labour. So first of all, these new due diligence obligations were introduced in January this year, and they effectively require Swiss companies to comply with due diligence and reporting obligations in two areas. First of all, when importing or processing conflict minerals, or offering products or services with risks of child labour. And these firms must follow the new requirements for annual reports, which start in 2024, covering the business year for 2023. And within these new rules, Switzerland is effectively bringing itself in line with the EU and international rules and regulations, including the EU Conflict Minerals Regulation and the corresponding OECD guidelines. And the Swiss legislation, these two amendments are going to affect the Swiss Code of Obligations and the Due Diligence and Transparency Ordinance. So what is the scope and extent of these obligations? Under the new rules, any company which has a registered office or head office in Switzerland must comply with their due diligence duties in their supply chain and reporting obligations if they have activities in one or both of the following areas. So either importing, processing of minerals or metals with quantities exceeding certain thresholds containing tin, tantalum, tungsten or gold from conflict or high-risk areas into free circulation in Switzerland or processing these minerals in Switzerland. The second option is offering products or services in Switzerland or abroad for which there is a reasonable suspicion that they are manufactured or provided using child labour, as defined by the International Labour Organization. And a reasonable suspicion is present when there exists a substantiated indication for inadmissible child labour based on internal or external information. There are cases where companies are exempt from these obligations relating to child labour specifically, and it's either if the company is a small or medium-sized enterprise or presents a low risk of child labour. So a company is presumed to have a low risk of child labour if it exclusively sources products or services from countries classified as basic by the UNICEF Children's Rights in the Workplace Index. However, no exemption is available for companies where there's concrete evidence on child labour in their products or services. And in practice, this will require more than a reasonable suspicion, such as in the case of specific instances of child labour reported by judicial bodies, professional associations, the ILO or other companies. Furthermore, there exists an exception to both obligations relating to conflict minerals and child labour if a company adheres to an internationally recognised set of rules. This will require that the company follows the rules in their entirety, publishes a report, and refers to the applied set of rules in its report. In the area of conflict minerals, it's either the OECD guidelines or the EU conflict minerals regulation, which must be applied. And in the areas of child labour, the exception requires companies to adhere to a list of relevant ILO conventions that are indicated in the ordinance. So compliance with an international set of rules can take place at the company or at the group level. So what do these due diligence and reporting obligations actually mean? What it requires is that the company must include a supply chain policy, a traceability system, a grievance system, and a risk management system. So to comply with the supply chain policy requirement, that policy must specify which instruments a company uses to identify, assess, eliminate or mitigate the risks of potential adverse effects in its supply chain. So this would include on-site checks, consulting experts, assurances from business partners or certifications. Moreover, companies must ensure that interested parties have an opportunity to report concerns about conflict minerals or child labour. In addition, the rules require companies to adopt a traceability system, which means that information is recorded on product origins, suppliers and processing steps. And finally, the risk management plan must be put in place that will monitor and identify risks in the supply chain relating both to conflict minerals and child labour. And all of these obligations are largely based on existing EU rules. So compliance with these new obligations must be documented in an annual report published within the first 6 months of the following business year. The responsibility to report is situated with the highest management or administrative body, which in many cases means the Board of Directors. The report must be prepared in an official language of Switzerland or English and describe how the due diligence obligations have been put into practice. And those reports must be published electronically and made available for a minimum of 10 years. In the area of conflict minerals, compliance with the due diligence obligations must be audited by an external specialist authorised by the Swiss Federal Audit Oversight Authority. Companies with a parent company in a third country whose parent company publishes an equivalent report do not have to publish a separate report. So in this case, it would suffice that the company refers to the parent in its annual report and publishes the parent company's report. This reporting must be done on a consolidated basis, and that companies must be covered by a consolidated report, therefore exempt from the reporting obligations. So what happens in terms of compliance and penalties? In the Swiss regulation, the new requirements do not contain provisions for company liability, but they do include penalties in the form of fines for failing to report or inadequate reporting. So there could be a liability of a fine of up to 100,000 Swiss francs to individuals responsible for the missing or incorrect reports, as well as those failing to make accessible reports for the required period. And in the case of negligence, the fine is reduced to a maximum of 50,000 francs. So as these developments show, this is all part of companies all around the world coming under increasing pressure to monitor and address how their supply chains affect their environmental, social and governance related issues. And as always, active preparation is key for companies to stay on top of new obligations and align with requirements in different jurisdictions. And I'll say a bit more on that later in the context of the impact on human trafficking. But now I just want to tell you a little bit about two cases which were brought by Trial International against Swiss companies for violations in their supply chain. Both of the cases I'm going to talk about are in the context of pillaging, so more in the conflict minerals space. But nevertheless, I think it's interesting just to hear how these played out. So the first case took place in November 2013, where Trial initiated proceedings against a company based in Ticino, which was refining almost 3 tons of gold mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo between 2004 and 2005. And this gold had allegedly been pillaged by a rebel group. So during the year and a half that followed, the Office of the Attorney General conducted an investigation as a result of this complaint into war crimes and aggravated money laundering, resulting in the refinery company's headquarters in Ticino being searched. This case also sparked a civil society campaign against pillaging precious metals in times of armed conflict. In 2015, this case was closed. The Attorney General's office concluded that there was insufficient evidence that the company had been aware of the gold's criminal origin. Strikingly, though, the federal prosecutor did recognise that the gold had been pillaged in the Democratic Republic of Congo by a militia group. But because of the absence of a Swiss law framework for due diligence, it meant that this company was not legally obliged to investigate who they do business with or where any purchased goods came from. And at the time, Trial's founder, Philip Grant, commented that without a duty of due diligence, it is impossible to demonstrate intent, which is key to constitute pillage. Switzerland must adopt a regulation that requires companies to know where goods come from, as is the case of many banks that comply with Know Your Customer guidelines. Imposing a duty of due diligence means preventing that such shortcomings reoccur and prohibiting companies at fault from shirking their responsibilities. So, in a way, I think Philip's comments were well ahead of their time, and it's a shame that it's taken almost 10 years, in fact, for Switzerland actually to introduce the regulation that I've already described. The second case that Trial brought was in November 2016, and that was in partnership with the Open Society Justice Initiative, where a criminal complaint was filed against a Swiss businessman, Christoph Huber, who was operating also in the trade of minerals. During the second war in the DRC between 1998 and 2003, Huber was allegedly directly linked to an armed group accused of war crimes that occupied and de facto administered large territories in the east part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The events in question occurred in 2001, and at that time, Mr. Huber allowed one of the companies he was working for to obtain concessions from the militia, along with guarantees of protection by soldiers of the armed group. He'd been involved in the mineral trade in the region at least since 1997 on behalf of other companies, some of them which were also Swiss-based. Commercial documents obtained during the investigation clearly demonstrate the links between the militia group and the Swiss businessman. One of Swiss Trial's legal advisors said that there was no choice but to file a criminal complaint against Mr. Huber as an individual, because the possibility of doing the same against a company was at the time particularly limited under Swiss law. In this case, however, the problem was even more complex because Mr. Huber's business ties with the Swiss companies in question had in the meantime been terminated. And again, the outcome in this case was that the absence of the duty of due diligence, coupled with legal liability in the Swiss legal framework, meant there was an absence of a legal avenue to prosecute the economic actors who were effectively accomplices in international crimes. So just finally, some observations really on the impact of the Swiss regulation on trafficking and in particular child labour, which of course this regulation seeks to address. Really the impact is that it's imposing an obligation to have the supply chain policy, which forces companies to identify, assess and eliminate and mitigate the risks of potential adverse effects in its supply chain. So what this means in practice is the company now has to make sure there are appropriate on-site checks, that the company is consulting experts. For example, the two cases I've talked about, these were in conflict regions. There are many companies who have, of course, their businesses in the similar sorts of regions, and they should be consulting experts to understand how their supply chain is linked, particularly any local companies that they are working with, and receiving then from those members of their supply chain the appropriate assurances that the appropriate due diligence has been carried out, and also certifications. I mentioned that companies must now ensure that parties are able to report concerns about conflict minerals or child labour. And in addition, that there is a traceability system that records information on product origins, suppliers, and the processing steps. And of course, there must be a realistic risk management plan, which will monitor and identify risks in the supply chain. So it's an ongoing obligation. It's not just a matter of saying, oh, we are fine. The board of directors effectively is responsible for making sure that their suppliers continue to respect the obligations and continue to comply. I think the big question around the Swiss regulation is the efficacy of enforcement. I told you a bit about fines, but these fines relate to the reporting. So we're not really talking about the conduct in the supply chain. So really what is needed is an enforcement mechanism effectively with a criminal sanction. And there is no detail in the Swiss regulation as to how due diligence obligations should be enforced specifically with respect to child labour. It's also unclear how the breach of these due diligence obligations may be considered as a fault and lead to a tort in civil liability proceedings. So this lack of an enforcement mechanism is a real weakness in the Swiss regulation. And I think there's an opportunity here for organisations like ours to lobby the Swiss authorities to amend the regulation and bring it in line with many EU member states which have adopted a criminal liability in their equivalent legislation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula. Indeed, very interesting. This Swiss example is interesting both for opportunities and for limits. Mm-hmm. And as you know, there is now a new law for economic, social responsibility in Switzerland, which will be probably submitted to a vote possibly next year or in 2 years. But still, you were, and we shall be trying to discuss that in the discussion, you were Monday, Tuesday, and yesterday in the Business and Human Rights Forum at the UN. And this was a topic which was discussed not only for the Swiss example, but also at the international level. Yes. And the link between domestic legislation, guiding principles, and binding treaties. So clearly, we can discuss that further after we hear our speakers.
Yes.
But thank you very much for raising this, I think, interesting example. Thank you. And now we have a video by Anissa Bjornic. Mrs. Bjornic has worked with multiple governments and organizations to both identify human trafficking victims and networks, and now provides training to others so that they might do the same. She is a member of OSCE, International Survivor Advisory Council, ISTAC. She is also a member of Interpol's Human Trafficking Expert Group and a member of the Global Association of Human Trafficking Schools. She is also the CEO and founder of Cyber Night Watch, an intelligence agency that has trained Canadian law enforcement officials how to identify and disrupt criminals engaged in criminal exploitation online and human trafficking. And I would like to thank also Helena for providing us the connection to Alisa.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, let me begin by thanking the Sovereign Order of Malta and the Geneva Center for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue for inviting me to this important meeting today. My name is Elisa Gabiorchik, and I am the founder and CEO of Cyber Night Watch, an open source intelligence expert, first responder, and a certified human trafficking investigator. I am also a member of the OSCE's and ODIHR's International Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Council, part of Interpol's Human Trafficking Expert Group, certified cryptocurrency investigator, and a member of the Global Association of Human Trafficking Scholars. Leveraging my expertise as an intelligence operative, I've played a pivotal role in combating human trafficking around the world through the identification of victims using indicators recognized by law enforcement and government agencies. I've collaborated with various stakeholders to expose human trafficking networks operating in many countries. My contributions extend to actively participating in the generation of more than 1,000 intelligence reports that identify human trafficking and assist law enforcement. I have led and assisted international operations and gathered intelligence on human trafficking networks around the world. My work includes an in-depth analysis on the exploitation of Ukrainian women and children following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In only 42 days, I have successfully identified more than 15 potential victims and uncovered 2 large networks potentially trafficking refugees out of Ukraine. This led to the creation of Cyber Night Watch, a leader in intelligence collection and analysis and open source intelligence investigations. I have trained and assisted law enforcement agencies such as Interpol, the South African Police Service, the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation in South Africa, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in identifying and disrupting large organized crime. Additionally, my training has included financial institutions, nonprofit organizations, and members of the community. My team and I conduct research, provide specialized training, develop investigation techniques, analyze data, assist in worldwide operations. From first responders to research psychologists, our dynamic team comes from a wide range of specialized backgrounds. In addition to collecting and analyzing data, we also provide consultancy services to our partners on how to identify and disrupt large organized crime online and in the field. My team and I have used our passions to identify and disrupt criminals who exploit vulnerable populations. We do so by using digital outreach, raising awareness through our training and resources, developing partnerships with others who share the same passion, making eye-catching content, and simply engaging the community in important conversations. For example, in the coming week, I will speak on the webinar hosted by Dr. Michelle Boutte and Ana Lucia Maraca Pacheco on challenges and best practices in human trafficking policy, legislation, investigation, and victim support services for male victims. This shows the importance of these global partnerships, highlighting each other's strengths, but also sharing our found best practices and challenges to the community so that we can all work together in a better manner, supporting victims regardless of gender. The protection of children is one of my top priorities. Protecting children against human trafficking is a multifaceted challenge that demands a comprehensive and collaborative response from all parts of society. One crucial aspect of this effort involves education and awareness initiatives, but there must be equal efforts in all aspects to be able to make an actual impact in disrupting the operations of organized crime. Community engagement plays a pivotal role in creating a protective environment. Building strong relationships with local communities fosters trust and encourages the reporting of suspicious activities. Training and capacity building are essential components of an effective response and, more importantly, in preventative measures. Providing law enforcement, social workers, and medical professionals with the necessary training on identifying signs of trafficking and implementing appropriate response protocols is crucial. Early intervention, prevention, and support programs are critical for addressing the root causes of trafficking by developing initiatives that target not only at-risk populations but all. We can provide support and resources before individuals fall victim to trafficking, establishing systems, procedures, and protocols that facilitate swift responses to potential cases. Coordination and collaboration are paramount in the fight against human trafficking. Building strong partnerships between local, national, and international agencies ensures the effective sharing of intelligence, resources, and best practices. Utilizing technology for data analysis and tracking stands as a crucial strategy for identifying patterns and potential human trafficking networks. The monitoring of online platforms and social media for potential recruitment activities significantly enhances the capability to intervene before victims fall prey to exploitation. Holding social media platforms accountable is equally imperative, especially concerning their facilitation of child sexual abuse material and child trafficking. Relying solely on technology to identify and respond to activities on these platforms has proven insufficient in curbing the crimes conducted within their realms. Therefore, it is essential to emphasize the accountability of social media platforms, recognizing that technology, while a powerful tool, cannot be relied upon in isolation. The fight against child exploitation and child trafficking demands ongoing research and the continuous updating of systems. Criminals evolve their verbiage, tactics, and techniques on a daily basis, underscoring the need for a proactive approach to technological solutions. Furthermore, and most important, adopting a victim-centered approach is critical, with a dedicated focus on the well-being and rehabilitation of survivors in the aftermath of trafficking experiences. This approach prioritizes the safeguarding of children, making their welfare the foremost concern. In alignment with the OSCE's NRM national referral mechanisms, all interactions and communications involving children must consistently prioritize their specific rights and best interests. This means that all communication, or any communication, intervention, or action with children occurs within environments that are child-centered, trauma-informed, and safe. According to my colleague, a policy expert and member of ISTAC, advocacy for stronger legislation and policies is essential to create a robust legal framework that addresses the root causes of trafficking and provides better protection for victims. It is crucial that stakeholders and survivors work closely with lawmakers to ensure that legislation is applicable to survivors and provide sustainable resources and aftercare support to ensure there is no re-exploitation. This must include stronger penalties for those who purchase children for sex and labor purposes. In the U.S., there is a lack of trauma-informed response and care by law enforcement and agencies assigned to assist children who report abuse, and it makes it increasingly difficult to get cooperation for convictions. We must have consistent training and buy-in by agencies who work with and walk with minors in their pursuit of justice. Policies that can work to enforce proper survivor and trauma-informed approaches to assist the victim in coming forward are essential to the success and prosecution of traffickers and buyers. If legislation is created to assist the victims but does not add for stronger penalties for those who purchase minors, the law is nothing more than a piece of paper and will not ensure safety or security for victims to come forward. I will end my response with these questions for the audience today. To what extent is society prepared to go to ensure the protection of our children? What if safeguarding involves holding politicians, CEOs, and officials at various levels of government, both domestically and internationally, accountable for their actions? To what degree is society willing to resist and make sacrifices, even if it means disrupting profitable business ventures? When will the tolerance for those who enable and foster child exploitation come to an end? When will the discussions and meetings we engage in translate into tangible responses and decisive actions? Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. It's very interesting, but what I liked most is your emphasis on the victim-centered approach, because indeed victims and survivors are the real experts, and indeed should guide our efforts. And now, really, if I would say, you're a keynote speaker, and you've been quite a few times on our webinars, and now you're coming from Lyon, but even if you are a citizen both of Canada and Costa Rica, and you worked with the Canadian government, Interpol, NGOs, and various other organizations for over 10 years in support of human trafficking survivors and victims. And indeed, you did write excellent dissertation on male victims, and I think it's a very interesting dissertation available for free online. You did that in Canada, in Vancouver, and I must say I was quite impressed in reading this. And you are also a co-founder and global ambassador of the U.S. Council on Violence Against Men and Boys, as well as the CEO and senior advisor for research and development of Cyber Night Watch, we just see. So please, I'm looking forward for your message today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would first like to extend my deepest gratitude to the Sovereign Order of Malta and the Geneva Center of Human Rights Advancements and Global Dialogue. And thank you again to Dr. Michelle Gini and the organizing team for hosting this crucial meeting today. So my name is Ana Lucia Mariaca Pacheco, and I'm honored to represent the U.S. Council on Violence Against Men and Boys as their co-founder and global ambassador. Over the past 13 years, I have worked with various agencies worldwide towards the common goal of raising awareness and stopping human trafficking. From reshaping Canada's criminal code on human trafficking and engaging with trafficked victims around the world, to now working on human security research, global anti-trafficking projects, and public advocacy on these critical issues. So I can summarize my story that brought me here in 3 moments. Let me tell you about the first one. The start of my journey in 2010, when I first saw a little girl named Anita. She was barely 2 years old at the time when she was dropped off in a cardboard box at the doorsteps of an NGO in San Jose, Costa Rica. On her body, her bones were shattered, and she was covered with scars of cigarette burns from her family. And I remember her little laugh when we would do physical therapy together. She would laugh to try to hide the tears, but she was so strong. And witnessing her resilience inspired me to dedicate my life to the fight against human trafficking and human rights, especially for children. And the moment began a lifelong journey to those that have been harmed by trafficking and human rights violations. and for those that always think about money and never about the suffering they inflict on their victims. So let's move on to the second moment in 2011, when I found myself working in remote rural villages, small areas, and major cities in Cambodia on a humanitarian aid mission. It was then when I first witnessed human trafficking with my own eyes. Our team identified several karaoke bars in Phnom Penh which openly sold sexual services with children. Small menus written in black marker listed many forms of abuse and exploitation on sale for only a few dollars. These kids sat closely together on these dirty couches, and each on their shirt marked a number to help the customer choose their preferred victims. These were just children, scared and totally unprotected from the perpetrators just a few seats down. This was no longer distant news stories on websites, but rather tangible. Helpless children were just an arm's length away, and I'll never forget the pain that I witnessed that day. Now I will share the third moment. While working at Interpol in 2018, I came across a report that unveiled the severe online abuse suffered by infants, toddlers, and boys of all ages. Male children scored highest in the terms of severity of their abuse based on the Copine scale. And these boys were suffering the most severe abuse, and they were victim to unimaginable horrors such as bestiality, live torture, and murder. And before this moment, I had only worked with women and girls, and my own internal bias assumed that females were the main victims, and that this must not be a problem for men and boys around the world. But when my gender bias was challenged, it compelled me to learn more about male victimization. But I noticed that there were fewer studies and very little advocacy and social services focusing on men and boys. When I encountered where a dominant societal narrative that cast victims as female and perpetrators as male. The literature suggests that many frontline professionals struggle to even perceive boys as potential victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. But today I come here to challenge these preconceptions, aiming to redefine the narrative on victims and perpetrators in the context of human rights. International and national legislations aligned with legal frameworks have predominantly focused on the violence against women and girls. Despite the inclusion of male victimization in some legal instruments, the implementation often associates male victims with the image of a vulnerable girl. For example, let's do a quick language analysis of the Protocol to Prevent and Suppress and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, or also known as the Palwankar Protocol. So a keyword search reveals a stark imbalance in addressing male and female victims. The word male, man, men, or boy results in 0 hits. In comparison, 8 hits when searching for just the word woman. Even though the term child refers to a person under the age of 18, and of any gender, the inference from the imbalance of word choice is that the child is most likely a girl. And in Article 2, the statement of purpose also highlights that the focus is on prevention and combating trafficking in persons by paying a particular attention and interest to women and children while fully respecting their human rights. So we can be more clear and more balanced and be more inclusive in our language when we use to describe these issues, especially in these legal and national frameworks. And according to the United States Department of Trafficking in Persons, in 2019, there were over 24 to almost 25 million people trafficked globally. And after COVID-19, it was estimated that 49.6, as you said, 50 million are in forced labor. And of those 27.6 million that are in forced labor, 6.3 are trafficked and forced into commercial sexual exploitation. So this is a very clear indication that human trafficking and slavery are increasing and at a very drastic speed. We also know that statistics like these never capture the full extent of the problem, because within these statistics, we can only include those that we consider to be victims. We only count those that come forth, that seek help and are believed to be victims by frontline professionals such as law enforcement, NGO workers, and researchers. Unless things change, these statistics will most likely always be underreported for men and boys, as they are for women and girls. In many countries, the absence of any conviction in human trafficking cases with male victims of sexual exploitation reflects the impact and a very real concern about underreporting. To this day in Canada, we do not have one convicted case of human trafficking with a male victim of sexual exploitation. So to our statisticians, perhaps this is not significantly relevant, or to frontline professionals, they may think this is clearly not happening. But then how and why do I personally know so many male victims and survivors of human trafficking all over North America who just wished to be listened to and to be heard and to be believed? Over the last 6 years, I've worked closely with male victims and survivors, and I've conducted dozens and dozens of interviews, learning from firsthand accounts and what frontline professionals have done to support victims efficiently, but also learned as a collective society, what have we done that greatly harmed victims? All the participants in my research study reported experiencing significant gender bias and skepticism about their victimization when dealing with frontline professionals, such as police, medical staff, and mental health professionals. The survivors told me that services rarely believed their claims, and they were often dismissed by the very same people whose their jobs were to help them. As reported by one of the participants, whose alias is called Wayson, after unlocking repressed memories of his trafficking during his adulthood, he checked himself into a hospital and disclosed the incidences that he had recalled to the mental health professionals there. Wayson said that none of the mental health staff believed his story and instead placed him in an involuntary hold for a 4-week psychiatric hold and visit, where he was forcibly medicated. Wayson just wanted to be free, but he had to take back his disclosure of his child sexual abuse, exploitation, and trafficking to the hospital staff, even if this meant that he was forced to deny his very real, traumatic lived experiences. And this was just a few years ago in Canada. I believe that the society-constructed gender and social biases are determining factors in these institutional failures, because such biases serve as a kind of cognitive shortcut. These shortcuts lead frontline professionals to mistakenly assume that perpetrators of sexual abuse and exploitation and trafficking must be men and the victims must be women and girls. And again, frontline professionals themselves has reported in other studies that these biases are actually impacting them when they're in contact with potential boy victims. And in my research, we see this belief is a big factor that harms male survivors. When disclosing their sexual exploitation to frontline professionals, many survivors reported that they were met with skepticism, disbelief, a lack of understanding of the grooming process and tactics, and were met with an overtly gender bias where a person disclosing had their experiences dismissed for male victimhood, and in some cases, the dismissal of female culpability when there was a female perpetrator to the survivors, ultimately resulting in no action being taken on their behalf. So as a society, we must first learn how to identify male victims and then find the most effective way to provide restorative services and afford justice to male victims in line with their basic human rights from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when thinking about reintegration back into society after trafficking, most victims remain stuck in a cycle. Occurrence, when the trafficking happens; silence, this inner struggle to not disclose; an era of acting out. This could be drug abuse, alcoholism, failed relationships, violence towards others. And if there is no intervention at this stage, then a victim can fall into the next stage, which is lifelong ramifications and consequences. This could be divorces, lack of contact with their children, alcoholism, drug addictions, depression, long-term health consequences, and even suicide. And my research suggests that the intervention first needs to come from the victims themselves. They must inquire for support, services, and disclosure to get out of this dangerous cycle. But this means the interactions with frontline professionals like us here can either bring them to end their era of silence or keep them there longer, which can last up to decades. And it is imperative that we bear in mind that individuals who have experienced human rights abuses, particularly those related to trafficking, are not only healing from the pain and the trauma that they have endured, but also the ways that we have treated them when they were asking for help. As both individuals and collective, we must exercise discernment in our words and actions when offering support, abiding by the do no harm principle, recognizing that our actions have potential to either worsen their trauma or contribute to the healing process. This underlines the responsibility we bear in fostering a supportive and safe environment. One of the participants, a trafficking survivor, told me this: "Being believed today has helped inspire me and provide me with a small sense of closure and peace. However, today was merely the tip of the iceberg for the new chapter of my life. It feels like the more you share, the more you realize you're not alone and it's not your fault. It's not only possible for adult survivors of sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, or human trafficking to make a tremendous impact to enhance the work of advocacy, research, and frontline work and services to others who have been victimized, but this is a must. All the survivors want, regardless of gender, is to be actively listened to and believed. We see true healing when they feel respected, gain a sense of autonomy from their trauma. Therefore, as experts, prioritizing solutions first and training first is not always the solution. We need to remember that these victims and survivors are people with very human needs that need to be listened to, feel respected, and regain a sense of dignity. These core human rights needs should be placed first before addressing the bigger problem. So this is what led to the creation and development of the U.S. Council on Violence Against Men and Boys. I just wanted to share my insights and find like-minded people who wanted to fight for human rights for all victims, regardless of gender. The U.S. Council is a dedicated collective representing 25 cross-sectors of professionals, lived experts, advocates, researchers, educators, public health stakeholders, and community members that are committed to dismantling the barriers that perpetuate violence and trauma against males in our society. Establishing with the conviction that every individual, regardless of gender, deserves to live free from violence and its debilitating aftermath. We tirelessly work towards a more just and equitable future for all. And the Council's purpose is clear: to challenge and change the narratives surrounding violence against males as a public health crisis, fostering a society where all individuals can thrive without fear, prejudice, or harm. By illuminating the root causes and effects of violence and trauma, we strive to empower communities, policymakers, and institutions to make positive change. And the mission of the U.S. Council on Violence Against Men and Boys is to advocate, to research, and to educate on matters on violence and trauma experienced by men and boys. And rooted in this public health framework, we delve deep into the complexities of the issues, aiming to eradicate the impacts on the individual, but also on the communities. Our vision is one where a society that values the well-being and safety of every person, regardless of gender. And we envision a world where boys can grow, learn, and thrive without the shadow of violence looming over them. And through data-driven insights, lived experiences, research, and scientific integrity, we strive to create a future where violence is the exception and no longer the norm. And we are working together with our partners. And so just next week, we'll be participating in the webinar, Challenges and Best Practices in Human Trafficking Policy, Legislation, and Investigation. and victim support services for male victims. And this is the fourth in the series of webinars that teach frontline professionals about male victimization, hosted by Michelle and the Sovereign Order of Malta. Thank you very much. And we are committed to sharing knowledge and resources with the public, professionals, and stakeholders. Our educational program aims to empower individuals in our community with the tools and information needed to prevent and respond to violence and trauma. When the global community finally sees and understands and engages with our content, then that's when we finally see real change. And at the U.S. Council, we stand united in our pursuit for a safer, more equitable world for all. Together, we can create a lasting change to ensure that every individual, regardless of gender, can live in a free life from violence and trauma. And as you can see here, in June 2024, the U.S. Council will host its very first global conference in Miami, Florida. This conference is survivor-led and trauma-informed, and we aim for it to be a transformative public health intervention. And we aim for it to be educating and build capacity building to help address the often overlooked issue of violence against men and boys. And with a focus on redefining this, again, as a health issue, we're hoping to bring to this conference the private sector, government, healthcare, social services, criminal justice sector. Within this, we can gain practical knowledge and skills that are necessary to prevent and respond effectively to all forms of violence. And through a heightened awareness of the scope of traumatic experiences by males, attendees will explore the structural determinants of numerous types of violence related to impacts on mental and physical health, education attainability, criminal justice involvement, re-victimization, financial stability, and public safety. So I take this opportunity to invite you all to Miami next year in support of our work, that including men and boys in our discussion finally. While it is so important to address human trafficking and human rights, which demand our unwavering attention and collaborative efforts, it is also important that we stand together and we are inclusive when identifying potential victims of some of the most severe violations of our human rights. So let's not forget that victims can be of any gender and of any age. And I would like to finish a quote from John Michael Lander, founder of An Athlete's Silence, a lived expert, and a man whose resilience and inner strength inspires my ongoing commitment to advocate for universal human rights. With his gracious permission, I present his statement. We need to look at the long-term effects of sexual abuse and trafficking as two separate entities. The trafficking event itself, and number two, the meaning the survivors place on the event, feelings and emotions. The event is traumatic, an extortion from the exterior presence, but the inner meaning we attach to understand and comprehend why it happened can be much more detrimental. Since the experience, survivors struggle every day battling against the internal negative self-talk to appear and function normally as possible based on the stigmas of our society bestowed upon us. In hindsight, I realize I punished myself through shame, guilt, and embarrassment, and negative self-talk. As survivors pursue their healing journey, they are not very far from being triggered by outside influences that will rapidly return their psyche to the exact moment of the event. Even if they have had perfected in the numbing and distance strategies to protect themselves, and since each survivor is unique, their healing journey needs to be individually devised for optimum success. Sharing our stories help others while providing ourselves with the critical insight to heal. I want people to understand that healing is a lifelong journey. So human rights are non-negotiable and fundamental, guiding our collective responsibility, as we have said, towards a more humane and just society. So I urge you here to take this knowledge gained from today's meeting and to turn it into action. Whether you work in policy, legislation, investigations, or any other field, your contribution matters. Together we can make meaningful impact and contribute to a world where human trafficking is eradicated and survivors are provided with the support and care they deserve regardless of their status, their ethnicity, their religion, or genders, because all survivors matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for your intervention, reflecting your field experience, academic research, advocacy work, and for your key message to actively listen to victims and survivors and to train stakeholders, of course, and also the role of civil society, including the associations we are mentioning. I think now it's time for discussion, question and answers. I don't know. Oh, yes. Abdulaziz, please.
So, first of all, I would like to thank the panelists for this incredible discussion, and it's very important that we pay attention to this. I will start off with two questions. The first one is for Mr. Palwankar. The four pillars of your organization that you mentioned, research and publication, training, international advocacy, and the platform for global dialogue, are very comprehensive. Can you share specific success stories or challenges in each of these that highlight their impact on addressing human trafficking? And the second question is for panelist Vichello. The International Catholic Migration Commission has been working on the causes that you mentioned, such as extreme poverty and undocumented birth registration. How can organizations collaborate effectively to address the root causes and create sustainable solutions?
Thank you very much. Enough? Or?
No, it's decided.
Hmm?
Your question.
Yes.
I thought it was for someone else as well. But there are many ways that we must work together. So I think one thing is that at times we distinguish too much and divide the global level, the international level, with the national levels and the local levels. And I think we have to make sure that our efforts are touching all of those levels, and especially, as Ina just talked about, that we include the voices of the people who are directly experiencing these things, and also they have the best sources for the way we solve these situations. I'll give an example. I quoted from a Vatican guidelines on how church organizations, Catholic Church and other organizations, could be working on the prevention of human trafficking and also responses to human trafficking. Those guidelines were developed by listening to the voices of all of the people involved, all of the stakeholders, including the people who were living with these experiences. And in fact, I think Michelle was with us, and we gathered about 200 people in Rome after all of this research and listening had been done, and then we developed those guidelines together. And at each of the group tables, as we worked on those guidelines, there was someone who had experienced trafficking at each table, because they were the people we looked to first. In addition to theologians, lawyers, social workers, mental health professionals, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's really by working together that we find the responses. And then I think it's really important that we also improve our advocacy with the national governments and also with the multilateral organizations like we have here at the United Nations, because they often have the power to make changes, but we also have to make sure they don't just sign very nice flowery languages. And I've sat in many committee meetings where we've debated where we put the punctuation point or what exact word we want to have where, but then we come up with often a good document, but it doesn't get implemented. So that's the other thing. I mean, many times, even here in the United Nations, we have documents and we have signatories by hundreds of governments, with all due respect to the governments here in the room, but we don't have a way of enforcing those things, of monitoring, and of also making sure that these are implemented. So I think those are a couple of different ways that I would see us working with others on this.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, yes, please.
So your first question was addressed to me. Thank you for it. I think I'll be very brief because as I mentioned at the outset of this panel, when Michel gave me the floor, is that this is the first time we are collaborating. That's a very positive step. And as I also mentioned, we focus on human rights and certain focus areas. Human trafficking in particular wasn't one of them because we had others. So this is also a learning experience for us. But I'd also mentioned that in all our focus areas, the effects of human trafficking do, have a consequence on them. For example, freedom, equality, non-discrimination, gender-based violence, children's rights, access to education and justice. Human trafficking is detrimental to all of these basics. So all our former panels and our discussions and reportings, in a way, by these values and fundamental human rights contributed. But now we can start becoming more specific with regard to specifically the human trafficking side of things. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Please.
First of all, just I'm very happy to be here with you and we have my permanent mission, Ethiopian permanent mission in Geneva, and we are really interested on human trafficking and human rights related issues to work together with different stakeholders, including those institutions, civil organizations and international organizations, including you here. And thank you for the Sovereign Order of Malta and Geneva Center for Human Rights and Advancement and Global Dialogue and IC for organizing this event, really. We appreciate that. And I thank really the speakers, the panelists, for an excellent and insightful presentations and experience sharing, case study sharing, and very important on this very important topic. Just I want to a little bit just to say something about on three important points from my country's experience and the presentations here. The first thing that I want to discuss about, just to say something about, is the human trafficking cases and crimes, which is the most organized and shameful crimes really affecting every region in the world, including the Eastern Africa region, which I came from. So its embodied nature of irregular migration, supported by a very organized network of criminal actors working out of the region and the destination states in that region. And there is a kind of big city migrants comprising of like refugees are there, asylum seekers are there, migrants with different legal status and multiple vulnerabilities who are escaping just poverty, prostitution, often for transit, especially three main routes of irregular migration in East Africa. So based on that, recently Ethiopia has just, my country, made strides toward this countering the crimes of trafficking in persons. In April 2020, just Ethiopia brought into force a proclamation that provides prevention and suppression of trafficking in persons. This proclamation has established by itself a high-level council. This council has been chaired by the Deputy Prime Minister of the nation to spearhead the country's response to trafficking in person. So this shows that how much the case is serious around that region, and it attracts the attention of high-level officials to be intervened to demonstrate the political will to counter this organized crime. And also there is a national partnership coalition for the prevention and control of the crimes of trafficking in person, in collaboration with international organizations, civil societies, and UN International International Organization for Migration. We are working in preparing national migration policy. This is the first ever policy that was remarkable to counter this trafficking in person. And furthermore, Attorney General Office of the country, the Federal Attorney General, developing a specific strategy for prevention of just trafficking in person. So these are the very remarkable milestones for my country to take action against this organized crime, which brought very serious human rights violations of women, children, men, boys, and so it is very inclusive. And accordingly, in my country, only from 2018 to 2020, we have 2,332 cases in this regard, which are investigated, carried out by the police, and some of them have just resulted in the conviction, and some of cases are still pending. So this action is also demonstrates that how much we are facing the problem and how much we are working against to counter that one as well. So this is just to highlight the situation in the region and the commitment of my government in this regard. So the second point, I will be brief on this issue about root causes of trafficking. I think the root causes are very complex and multidimensional. There are multiple of actors in this regard, and the modalities of just practicing committing these crimes are different in our scenario. So the way forward should be multidimensional and it needs collective effort, which means just as the speakers just well noted that one, the state should be just collaborate together, the state to state, and state with civil societies, international organizations, institutions, social institutions like religious institutions, and the society itself should be collaborative on academic institutions, especially on awareness creation, and others, and the law enforcement agencies, the police, prosecution office, Ministry of Justice, and every institution in this regard. So it needs collective action, and because it is complex and multidimensional. The root causes are multidimensional, so it needs a collective and comprehensive and organized action in that regard. So finally, I invite you all here to work together with my mission here in Geneva, and as well as the national institutions in my capital, in Addis Ababa, the City of African Union, and others, many more international organizations. So I am very happy to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your precious time that you took to come here and present. I had two questions, so please bear with me. I had one question for the person. I'm so sorry if I pronounce it very incorrectly. Kolaska, yes?
Yes, well, you can call me Paula.
So I would like to ask about from Trial International.
Yes, that's right.
I would like to ask, once you have identified, since you mentioned the two cases from Switzerland, once you've identified the violations in human trafficking, like in the supply chain, what kind of sanctions or remedies are in place at Trial International that are undertaken, which ensure like all the eradication or mitigation of like the violation do not occur again? Like what kind of mechanism exists for it to not occur again? And my second question was, anyone in the panelists can take the as we establish the violations that take place in human trafficking in various fields of humanitarian fields, going from migrants, refugees, civil society. We also mentioned labor force, especially in private sectors that we have discussed. For instance, if we go in the specifics, for instance, the fashion industry, so the makeup that girls wear, or even sometimes males, or the clothes from luxury brands that exist in today's world, most of the chemicals and the materials and the clothes that come and the manufacturing is like they're collected from children half of our age. So what kind of enforcement laws or legislation exists in the advocacy department or all of these institutions very well organized? What kind of mechanisms exist that hold these private sectors accountable in like taking respective measures and not using children for these?
Thank you.
Shall I start? Yeah. So your first question, and thank you for raising that. I think I would describe trial as it's a small Geneva NGO with a very loud voice. So trial was set up 20 years ago by a Swiss lawyer here in Geneva, and part of the drive to set up the organisation was to seek accountability for survivors of war crimes, and to give those people a voice. So when we're talking about, a victim-centred approach, that's very much sort of at the heart of the organisation. And I think what's interesting about the two cases I talked about was that those cases were brought. The organisation has felt for a long time that there is a place for seeking corporate accountability, specifically in the context of war crimes. And even though there was a lack at the time of a legal framework within Switzerland to hold the companies accountable, those complaints were formulated in a way that made it possible to bring them to the attention of the authorities. And so trial brought those claims to the attention of the Attorney General in Switzerland in the form of a criminal complaint. And so they were formulated as war crimes, because in the two particular cases I talked about, it related to the pillaging of conflict minerals. And that played a very important role in bringing to the attention of the Swiss authorities that there are Swiss companies, within its jurisdiction, who are effectively potentially responsible to some extent for crimes going on very far away from here. And that is really what trial does in all its work, is it's trying to bring to the attention of the relevant authorities that there are these crimes ongoing and that they must, these individuals or companies must be brought to account. And I think this leads now to your second question, where you're asking about accountability for private company actors who have in their supply chains that perhaps not following, the right standards. And as you say, there's perhaps, forced labour amongst children. I think this is what's really exciting with what's going on. There's in the whole movement of ESG, so environmental, social and governance. We've seen in the last couple of years a really big shift in people recognising that companies do have these obligations. And companies suddenly, it feels to me, as a human rights lawyer, companies are suddenly putting human rights on their agenda. Before, I would say there was very much, not everyone, but with a lot of companies, there was just a lot of lip service given to, okay, we need to comply with this, and we just tick a box. Now, companies, boards of directors are putting on their agenda, where are we with ESG? What are we doing as a company in terms of our strategy, in terms of our policy? How are we verifying our supply chains? And that pressure is being put on them by the regulation that's being introduced by organisations. I mentioned the OECD, by the EU. So for EU member states, that's putting a huge pressure on 26 countries within the EU to implement those regulations into their national legislation. And I gave the example of Switzerland, the enforcement. There is no criminal liability, but many of EU member states have gone that step further, and they've put in a criminal liability, and that means the board of directors is criminally liable. If you've got child labour in your supply chain amongst your suppliers and you haven't identified that, then you are really at risk as a member of that board of directors. So that is a huge shift, and I think we're going to see, it's going to be really interesting when we see the first cases in fact, either being brought in the domestic courts or at a more international level. But I'm very hopeful now that we're moving in the right direction. And certainly companies can no longer turn a blind eye to that. And in fact, they are now, I think, bringing it into their company strategy, into their policies, and they are talking about it. And as Michelle mentioned, we've just spent 2 days at the UN, at the UN Forum for Business and Human Rights. The amount of companies and commercial organisations who attend this event, I think every year is increasing. Mm-hmm. And they want to be seen to be having a voice and to show what their company is doing positively to comply with, I suppose, the human rights agenda. So I hope that's gone some way to answer
just
the issues.
I can do like a follow-up.
Yes, please do.
You said there's there's positivity, but if you see UN signed to the World Economic Forum, they uphold the strongest partnership, and UN's goal obviously is for peace, security, stability in the society. But the World Economic Forum is all business leaders, and the core of business is profit maximization. So when these two goals of peace and profit, it's they're not very compatible if you think about it. So in terms, do you think that could give rise to more challenges, or do you think that's a good thing and it could still work out somehow?
Well, I suppose what I would say is go back to the point that I've already made. I think what's happening now with this increased regulation is that it's forcing companies to treat human rights compliance almost as important as profit. And that means investing the money into making sure that their compliance, that their supply chain is robust and that it is complying. So I think that is where the shift is happening. And I think I'm hopeful certainly that there will come a point where, companies understand that their reputation is priceless. You may have the turnover and the profit figures, but if your reputation goes down the drain because overnight you are exposed as having child labour in your supply chain, there will be no more profit. And I think that is it seems to be slowly getting through. And seems to be, more widely recognised by big brands, Coca-Cola, Nestle. These are all brands who have been held to account by NGOs, for example, like Oxfam, who've done, big reports about how these companies are lacking. And now these companies have taken that as an opportunity to present themselves as a model because they have addressed those problems. So they've said, okay, we're not going to deny we have these problems, but we've now taken steps to address them. And we want to be seen as how a company can be run in a sustainable, human rights compliant way. So I think my message is I'm optimistic that we can bring all these things closer together. But I don't know if anyone else has any.
I think our experience is more on another end, but it's also a way of feeding into these legal processes that have been developed. And I'll give an example. In Catholic schools, but I think a lot of government schools too, all over the world, children are expected to wear school uniforms. In the United States, the National Catholic Women, Council of Catholic Women, which has thousands of members throughout the country, they took on this issue of forced labor, and they did research on the companies that the different church groups were ordering their uniforms from. And then they identified where these were coming from, many times from outside the United States, but they were being produced under slave-like or forced conditions. And so they would identify that, tell the school officials about this, and then start a boycott against those companies. Also, it was a way of then feeding in those accusations to the legal processes. And I think that's an important way of involving people, because it often takes a very long time before you get to the courts. or the legal instances to enforce these kinds of sanctions on companies. So that's one way. Another way was the speaker on the video talked about Ukraine. I convened, at the request of the Vatican, and still do convene this, a working group of all of the major global Catholic organizations that were responding to Ukraine, and Michelle's is one of the largest, of course. And there we started meeting 2 weeks after the latest invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and we immediately identified that risk of trafficking. The traffickers were already at the borders. We were there too, but they were there before us. And so, we immediately put together the guidelines for prevention of this for the humanitarian workers from the churches who were greeting these people, but then also simple instructions for the people who were coming through. Many times they came through the train station and somebody said, many people of goodwill said, I will take you to my home, you could stay with me for a while. But there were many people with ill will that were doing the same thing. So I think those are the kinds of things that we could do to alert the general public, and then also to feed into the situation of the legal sanctions and the processes that could punish private employers.
Thank you very much, Mark. Anna, you want to?
Yeah, I would just like to add one thing. So to go off of what you both had said, I think there really does need to be an increase in the penalties, but not just financial, but in criminal cases. So, for example, just using the example of Canada, where I'm from, we do not have one case of male victimization. But just to go on that, any other cases where there is like female victims of labor, of sex trafficking, the penalties are quite ridiculously small. So you would get, and even 10 years ago, it wasn't even against the law to do this. You could get away with it. So you would get a longer sentence for, let's say, the drugs in your pocket that you were caught with than the 2 little girls in the trunk of the car. And so you would get maybe 6 years for the drugs and 6 months for the kidnapping and trafficking of minors. And so, of course, this has increased over time, but I think 3, 4, 6 years is clearly not enough for the crime at hand. And a lot of these traffickers, buyers, sellers, exploiters are taking advantage of that in a loophole in our system, which is a very low penalty rate for the crime and for the amount of money that can be made from that crime. So if we really put an increase in the conviction time, instead of 6 years, 25 years, 30, 40, 50, a life sentence or something like that, then that's when you're bringing real change to the system, because then they have to really evaluate, is this worth it? Is this crime worth the penalty, the punishment? Because, $600 in 6 months, anyone will, if they have a large enough trafficking network, you can just get someone to take the blame, go inside, you pay their family, until they come back out, and then they continue trafficking. And so it's just to increase that law mechanism as well when you're going with the other ones in hand.
Just another point on that is that a number of the national frameworks of the anti-trafficking require the victims to testify.
Yes.
And that means that a lot of victims will not do that, because they also know that their families in their home countries these are huge gangs of organized crime. So in the U.S., in their national law, which was done right after the Palermo Protocol was finished, and it was negotiated by some of the U.S. officials who were involved in those negotiations. They did not require the victims to testify, and they also gave a path to legal residence in the country. I later was involved with the Italian government in negotiating their law, and we put them together with the U.S. people so that they could understand, because the Italians were ready to say, if you want to stay in the country, then you have to testify against these. And there still are many governments that still have that requirement.
You're right, because indeed, yeah, I must just add that quite often victims are so traumatized, they are not able to, even if they would be willing to. Shall I?
Just one thing. Michel did a webinar last year, which is called Forced Labor and Transparency of Supply Chains Towards Prescriptive or Legal Mandatory Approaches. And we have a testimony, a video of Dame Sarah Fortman, who is the former UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, the highest policeman authority, and saying that it's not effective. And I'm afraid, I don't want to nuance what you say, but she says it's not effective. And the UK was the first. It's not enough, because if it's not mandatory, it's
But I think that, if I may, I think that's the shift that we're seeing. In the last 2, 3, 4 years, the guidelines and regulations being brought in by the EU, which are then forcing, that down trickle into the national legislation. But you're quite right with the enforcement mechanisms. Having the Modern Slavery Commissioner, that's obviously a very key role, but it's then giving those people the tools to actually enforce. And I think that is where we're seeing the weakness. But certainly there are examples of national jurisdictions where criminal liability is very much included as part of the penalties. So there's criminal liability, civil liability, and fines. And I suppose we want to see more of that. And going to your point, when it comes to criminal liability, what is the length of the sentence?
Two last. But still, yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for all the speeches on the floor today. I would like to ask a question. Just considering the specific nature of the issues that you have, gendered nature of the issues that you have brought to light today, would you say there is also a need for an indirect approach to the solutions, specifically targeting the detrimental, oppressive nature of the patriarchy when it comes to the way men and boys are received in society and by professionals regarding their victimhood?
Thank you very much for that question. And yes, to answer it in that way, I came at this as within my feminist point of view when I began my thesis, kind of seeing these different lenses and approaches to go with this. But that is definitely something that we have to consider within our society. Our society tells men, you can't have emotions, you can't share your feelings, you can't cry, you can't show weakness. And this is kind of involved in this view of what it is to be male, what it is to be masculine, which in some sense does come from this patriarchy point of view. And it really does need to be dismantled to a degree in the way where we as a society and as collective say, men are human just like women are human. We all should be allowed to seek support. We should all be allowed to disclose trauma that has happened to us, that has influenced us. We should all be able to ask for that help, to tell our story, to be believed. Unfortunately, in many of our societies, we do not have that in place, and a lot of social services don't even exist for men and boys. But that definitely is one of our first steps, is changing that narrative, challenging those conceptions, and really allowing for, a safe and equal space for anyone, regardless of gender, age, ethnicity, social background, to be able to tell their story and to be supported.
Thank just very quickly, how can that approach be implemented in the structures that are already in place?
So that's the challenge that we are hoping to do. So with the U.S. Council, I think the very first thing is to raise that awareness in order to have any change. When it came to human trafficking in Canada, everyone didn't even have an idea that it was happening there until we were raising awareness. We were showing the cases, we were bringing those stories out, and then that's when legal change began to happen and societal change began to happen. So just like for this topic, we're going to have to start with education, with raising awareness, with bringing those topics into these rooms and making it an issue that we also need to look into, bringing those people to the table, not just men, but those with disabilities, those from different groups, different ethnicities as well. So that I would say would be the very first step.
Thank you. Yes, you and Giacomo, please.
So how can rehabilitation and integration programs be tailored to meet the unique needs of child trafficking survivors and ensure their long-term well-being? As you mentioned, there are biases among women and men and also girls and boys. So are there different approaches that are implemented to eliminate post-trauma effects between male and female individuals or children?
Yeah, no, don't worry. So when it comes to the rehabilitation process for both men and women, it is similar to a degree, but there are different approaches depending on the situations, depending on every single individual. I would say, firstly, it is very individual to the person because not everyone has the same trauma story, the same background. There's many different forms of trafficking, and even within sexual exploitation and child abuse, stories vary quite a lot. So there needs definitely to be a tailored approach. Within my research and then within other research, when it comes to children, the actual age of abuse and exploitation is around, let's say, 11 to 14 for girls, but for boys it starts quite young, from literally a few months old up to the age of 8. And so we can see there already, just in the ages, there already needs to be a tailored approach just for boys and girls. Women, as I said in the previous question, do have the ability to kind of reach out to community, peer support, look for those social services a lot earlier, whereas men and boys tend to not even disclose, and if they do disclose, it might be 30, 40 years after the fact. So then that's another tailored need that needs to look into it. When I came into my research, it really seemed that the steps to go forward was first for like a self-evaluation, seeing what has occurred, accepting that it had occurred, and doing that research into like self-help books, into community groups, but mostly done in an anonymous way. Works really well for men. Then that goes into community, which means starting to look into community groups, starting to share your story for the first time with trusted individuals, with trauma-informed individuals. Then that goes into reaching out for peer support. So this could be specialized, tailored therapy groups. And then after that, it goes into then pursuing your life passions, what brings you joy again, and then kind of bringing that humanity back into your life and not just focusing on trauma, but building off of that. It can be similar for women and girls, but I feel like we have that possibility to start engaging in this process significantly sooner and without that much stigma involved. So we can, like myself, we can get therapy like this, whereas I think for a man, it'd be quite a little bit more difficult to convince them, you know, this is something you can do without fear of stigma or shame or something involved. So it's, as survivors, there is similar difficulties, but just like gender or just like age or different ethnicities will change how they can approach healing and what they have access to as well.
Thank you so much for this session.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you very much. My question is for
Palwankar.
The thing is that I'm first of all, I'm very impressed by the kind of work trying to do in the legal scenario for fighting against human rights abuses. when we came across the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo and the involvement with the Shep Group human rights cases, I came across this question, and the part of my question has already been answered. I am just interested in the fact that how has the lucrative aspect challenged or limited your when you demand for corporate accountability in Switzerland, so you can prevent or regulate the links between Swiss corporation, businessmen, and the share group engaging in forced labor with serious human rights abuses. So, does it happen that the lucrative aspects overpower the moral aspects, moral question arising in business linkages? In your experience of trade, what has been your experiences, and then how? I just want to know that it would be a blueprint for governments of developing countries to make required policy changes and fight illegal businesses with serious human rights offenses.
Thank you. I think there's a number of quite complex issues raised there, but I think I will try to answer the question in quite a simple way. Effectively, trial's mandate, if you like, is to use the national courts to seek justice for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So that's sort of the basic mandate. And as part of that, as part of the organisation's, I suppose, agenda, if you like, is this corporate accountability strand. The two cases that I talked about, part of the reason they were not successful in the Swiss courts, and only partly because there were other reasons why, but part of it was that there was an absence of a legal framework to make the companies liable. And the significance of telling you about those cases is because Switzerland has this year now introduced this due diligence framework, which means that potentially these cases would now have a different outcome. And that is very much the hope. And I suppose we will have to wait and see when the first case comes before the Swiss courts. But I think you raised an interesting point about precedent for developing countries and how they might seek to address corruption. I think the point is this model of using the national courts, which are in some ways much more nimble and able to see through these claims in a much shorter space of time than, for example, a big international mechanism. If you think about the International Criminal Court in The Hague, a case before the Hague mechanism is going to potentially take decades. And so adopting our victim-centred approach is why we focus on bringing claims in within national jurisdictions. And specifically, when we're talking about war crimes and crimes against humanity, we're doing that under the principle of universal jurisdiction, because universal jurisdiction gives national courts a jurisdiction to hear those claims specifically for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So that's a very special characteristic for those claims. And again, going back to the two cases I talked about, the pillage there was characterised as a war crime in order to give the Swiss court jurisdiction, which did not work in this case, but nevertheless, it might work in other jurisdictions.
Thank you.
Have you witnessed in your personal experience, the lucrative aspect kind of overpowering the moral questions, in the space of
could you elaborate a little bit so that I understand?
Like the business point of profit maximization and the lucrativeness of the linkages are kind of are they overpowering the moral questions sometimes? Related to the supply chain?
I think as a matter of enforcement, in this new Swiss framework that's been brought in, as a matter of enforcement, the only enforcement that exists is fines. And I suppose what I'm saying is that in addition to fines, there should also be a very clear civil and criminal liability. And potentially also a higher level of fines, because I think you do make a good point. At the moment, the maximum fine under the Swiss system is 100,000 Swiss francs. If we're talking about a huge global organisation, that is pretty small. That's a pretty small amount. So, yes, I think that is something that a lot of the national jurisdictions will have to think about when they're setting values, the penalties that are being imposed, to make it, seriously painful for global organisations for whom hundreds of thousands is really not very much at all.
Thank you, Paul. So, a very short and last question.
Considering we have gone over time, I think it's a bit unfair to ask the question, therefore I'll leave it at that.
Okay. No, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for all your questions and your interest. Now, you want to add a few words? Yes.
Okay, very quickly. Thank you very much for having organized with us this conference, this panel. Not being specialized in human trafficking, as I said, I have so many takeaways from this rich, very rich presentations, and I will just say root causes, for example, role of religious leaders, enforcement mechanisms, creating advocacy platforms for advocacy, community engagement, as Alicia had said. I think these are some of the takeaways I've noted, but there are so many others. So I would just wish to say that we will shortly prepare the report, and once it's validated, we'll put it out on the website and announce it on social media platforms. And I hope this will be the occasion to further collaborate with different issues like business and human rights, role of religious leaders to go the run against the human trafficking and so on. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you very much. No, I want to thank all the speakers and to say that actually next Tuesday we shall have a webinar from 6 to 7:30 with Enna, a webinar which will be online and could give you the details. And on the Monday, the 11th of December, in room 7 in Palais des Nations, we'll have also an event linked to the Global Refugee Forum, Refugee Protection and Human Rights. And we are organizing this with Caritas Internationalis and with UNHCR. So you are all invited to both. And thanks again for being here. I'm very happy to see every one of you. And I don't know if there a last word from any of the panelists.
Well, thanks for organizing it, and thanks for all the questions and the discussion we were able to have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you, and